Good day, everyone. I'm your host, Mike Lasecki, for today's webinar, Archiving with ATE Central, The Basics. Thank you for joining us today. Many of you are familiar with the Adobe Connect interface. You know that you're in listen-only mode using your computer speakers or other devices to listen to today's webinar and using the upper right chat panel, where you see messages already to use to ask questions of our presenters. We'll have a number of polls today where we're going to be asking you questions as well. Now, this webinar today is being produced by ATE Central, but this webinar series is brought to you by ATE Central. ATE Central acts as an information hub for the National Science Foundation's ATE grantee community. So thank you, ATE Central. Let me go ahead and advance to our presenter screen. It's my privilege today to welcome Rachael Bauer. She's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the principal investigator of ATE Central. Welcome today, Rachael. Would you say hello to everyone? Tell us a bit more about yourself, and then please introduce your co-presenter.
Hi, Mike. I'm happy to be here. We have an odd situation. If you can hear, we have a fire alarm going off in the building at the moment. So I'm going to keep moving along. I apologize for the odd background noise. We're thrilled to be here today. This is a very exciting topic for us. I'm going to turn it over to Kendra, who's going to go through a little bit of information about what we'll be doing today, and then we're going to have our first poll. Kendra, are you with us? Ooh, I'm sorry, guys.
Right now. Probably
yeah, she seems to be on mute. Yeah. Okay.
Don't worry, Rachael.
Well,
we'll hold on just a second here.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and get the next slide going. Mike, how loud is that noise for you guys in the background? Can you hear that?
40% of the volume. It's about, yes, we can. It's about 40% of the volume of your voice.
Apologize for that, guys. These things happen in a live event. So the goal of our webinar today is to answer sort of three questions. What is the ATE Central Archive? Why is archiving so important to the community beyond the requirement from NSF? And how can ATE Central help you, your project, your work with grant writing? Is that okay? It sounds like Shannon's telling me the sound is okay, even though you can hear that background noise.
Sound is okay, Rachael. I'll tell you what, why don't let me take people into the poll for a minute, and you can just
That sounds great. I'll mute. That sounds great. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Rachael. And of course, isn't it exciting, folks, at these live events? While we're waiting and hopefully for things to resolve for them, let's take a look at the first poll question. So we'd like to ask this of you. Please respond. I would describe myself as, number one, affiliated with an ATE grant, that was funded under a prior solicitation, not currently funded but writing, or other. Let's go ahead. I'm going to launch that poll and give you an opportunity to respond. So this is a live polling here, and if you like, you can use the chat window to indicate the otherness of your situation. Now, currently I have the chat window turned off, but we'll have that come on in just a moment. So I can see many of you are logging into the poll, choosing your things. You probably know the answer to this, so I'm going to give you just a few more seconds to answer. Okay, good.
Okay, I'm back. I don't know, can everybody hear me?
Vast majority, almost. Hi, Rachael. Yes, we can.
Can you guys hear me at this point? Okay, great.
Yes, right.
So let's go to our next slide here. And thank you for everybody for filling that in. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the ATE program. So most of you are affiliated with ATE who are on the webinar today. As you know, ATE is a funding stream from the National Science Foundation. And one of the interesting things about ATE is it really focuses on community colleges being in a leadership role. That's unusual at NSF. We think it's a huge strength of ATE. The focus, of course, the primary focus is on program development, program improvement, particularly in the high-tech fields that we think of as sort of driving the nation's economy. There's also a big focus on partnerships with industry and others in the four-year and K-12 education communities. It's a long-running program. We're coming up on actually the 25th anniversary of the ATE program. All right, let's move on to our next slide and talk to you a little bit about ATE Central. So ATE Central's primary purpose is to amplify the impact of ATE. We work on bringing together information not only about the projects and centers. We have about 300 projects and centers in the ATE community, the centers being the larger funded projects. And we bring information about the projects, what they do, the centers, what they do, as well as all of the resources that they create. So our resource collection includes a lot of metadata about the various valuable deliverables that are offered by the community and created by the community. And we have a number of services and tools that are sort of integrated in and utilized by that metadata. Some of them like the archiving service. We also do a lot of outreach and dissemination, promoting the work of ATE, promoting the work of the program. And we're always excited to share the information that we have with folks like you all on this webinar. Talking to you a little bit about the archiving service. The service is really a community-driven service. We try our best to make sure that what we're doing not only supports the community, but reacts to any needs of the community. The service itself came out of the desire for NSF to make sure that the deliverables created by projects and centers were around for the long term and the long haul. You all may remember when the data management plan requirement first started. That came about in 2011. And the data management plan meant that NSF was really, really committed to making sure we're back I'm back in my office now, folks. The live fire drill is done. So thrilled about that. To making sure that the data and the resources created by NSF projects and centers weren't lost. And the archiving requirement speaks to that too. In fact, when you fulfill your archiving requirement, in many ways, you may be partially fulfilling the requirements of your data management plan too. And that's something that Kendra will be talking about in just a few minutes. The archiving requirement first started with the 14577 solicitation. It's been repeated in the most recent solicitation, the 1756 ATE. And basically, Kendra's going to talk to you a little bit about the specifics of the requirement. But the gist of it is that anyone funded under either of those two archiving, the two RFPs, are required to archive appropriate deliverables. This means digital deliverables, maybe curriculum, maybe professional development materials with ATE Central. And that means that they're held on our servers. It means if your site goes down or something happens to the resources that you have online, they're backed up in a way through ATE Central and they're still accessible. So I am going to turn it over to Kendra, who I think is back with us, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the ATE Central Archive. Kendra?
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for carrying on despite the building evacuations going on around you.
I'm very lucky that I had a laptop today.
Indeed. So
worked out well.
I'm a little bit out of breath from running back to my office, but I'll just go ahead and talk a little bit about what the archiving service is. So the ATE Central Archiving Service is a virtual space where the deliverables and some select administrative documents created by the ATE community are collected, stored, and made available in a digital format. Now you'll note the word stored is highlighted here. Storing resources on ATE Central servers is largely what differentiates archived resources from other cataloged resources in the ATE Central resource portal. So let's look at an example that highlights the difference. The ATE Central Resource Portal contains about 5,000 or so metadata records. And if you're not familiar with the term metadata record, you can think of it as sort of an online record that describes a digital resource, such as a PowerPoint or a video recording, much in the same way that a library catalog record describes a book or a DVD. The metadata record, or library catalog record, if you will, simply contains information that describes the resource itself. So one such metadata is illustrated for you on the right side of this slide, and then some of the circled content from this record is enlarged on the left. All metadata records will have a title. Here in this example, we have an overview of hybrid electric vehicles, HEV technology. Towards the right is the logo of the project or center that contributed the resource to the archive. In this case, we have the Center for Advanced Automotive Technology. All metadata records have a description and a screenshot of the resource. And towards the bottom of the record, you'll see the beginning of the metadata that we collect. So, for example, there's a URL and an associated file, and we'll come back to those in just a moment. You can see the creator and publisher information. And if you were to see the entire record, you would see that there's additional data. There's an ATE area. In this case, we have Advanced Manufacturing Technologies, Automotive Manufacturing as the ATE area. There are subject terms to enhance discoverability, and then you'll find information about the resource type, the format, educational level, the audience that the resource is intended for, and any information about access rights or content licenses that we might have. Some records have more data, some have less, but this is a good representation of what our metadata records generally will look like. Now back to that URL and associated file that are illustrated on the left-hand side of the screen. When there's a URL in our metadata records, we're linking our records directly to your website or wherever that resource might live online. Having the URL linked directly to your website is really valuable. It's important to us. We want individuals to find materials through our website and navigate back to your websites so that they can see other materials that you might have created or find additional information, activities, events, things like that. The problem, though, with providing these URLs is that they're not necessarily going to be available long-term. Some URLs will break. So sometimes a URL might break because a project or center has reached the end of their funding cycle and the web page is no longer available. Sometimes a project or center might decide to take down a resource and replace it with something newer. In either case, that URL is going to break, and so when you archive with us, what happens is that we attach a copy of your digital resource directly to the metadata record as an associated file. In this example, you can see at the top there are two attachments, and those are enlarged on the left. One is a PDF, and the other is a zip file. These attached documents or associated files are what make this particular resource an archived resource. If that URL breaks for any reason at all, we can simply remove it from the record and still provide access to a digital copy of your resource that has been stored on our servers. So that's what it really means to archive with us. We're attaching digital copies of resources directly to your metadata records. So, why would you want to archive? What benefit is there to archiving? Overall, archiving really broadens the impact and reach of the ATE community as a whole. ATE Central Archive provides a single access point to your materials. It's a place where ATE community members, STEM faculty, students, and the general public can search a large portion of ATE materials without having to find and browse the many ATE project and center websites that are out there. So really, all projects and centers can reach a much wider, more diverse audience. The archive ensures that the resources that you've created remain available online over a long period of time, regardless of what might happen to your funding in the future. The archive is something that you can discuss in your data management plan as you prepare your grant proposals for NSF, and it can also be part of your sustainability planning later on in your grant cycle. ATE Central provides assistance with both data management planning and sustainability. I won't really be discussing either of those in much detail today, but we do welcome your questions if you have any, and I will also be providing some additional links later on in the presentation about our sustainability services. And finally, we track the use of our website and provide relevant metrics to PIs in the form of activity reports. So these activity reports are provided either to the PI or other designated recipient every 3 months, and you also receive one annual report. And these reports provide information about how many people viewed the metadata records that we've generated for your resources, and other information that might be useful to you for your own reporting purposes, for outreach purposes, or for other advocacy efforts. So, before we move on and talk more about the service and the requirement itself, are there any other questions you'd like to address right now, Rachel?
Yeah, it looks like Carol asked if there was a fee associated with our archiving service, and that's an easy one. There isn't, but I guess, Kendra, do we want to, there's really not much else to add that there isn't a fee. But it's part of our job. It's actually integrated into our budget as part of AT Central to help with this. So I guess that's looks like somebody else might be typing a question. Oh, somebody else asked, hold on a second. Is putting something about AT Central archiving service in my data management plan recommended? And you sort of brought that up.
Yes, I do think that we would generally recommend mentioning it simply because it's going to be part of your requirement anyway. And so it's probably going to be really helpful to you as you think about your data management plan to think about what it is that we can, what services are already available to you and what we can offer. So that is also something that we can help with if you are trying to figure out what language to use in your data management plan about the AT Central archiving service and you're not too sure about that. Feel free to reach out to us and we can help you with the wording.
Okay, and we just got a whole bunch of other questions too. So Larry asked, what about videos? Does closed captioning have to be embedded within the video itself, or is it okay to rely on YouTube's closed captioning feature? That's one we've never had before.
No, we haven't. It's a good question. So we do it, yeah.
It's a really
so in terms of videos, we obviously do, of course, accept videos for the archive. I will note sort of on the side that if you are submitting videos for archiving, we do actually need the video files. We are unable to download things from YouTube. So you'd have to provide that to us through our submission form, which I'll talk a little bit later on about. Anything that has to do with accessibility is recommended, but it's not required by the ATE Central Archive. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that part, Rachel?
No, I think that's what I would have said. That's exactly what I would have said too. Of course, we love it. We love to see those closed captions, but if you weren't able to get them on, it's fine to archive without them. John asked, what if a change needs to be made to some of your documents? How easy or hard is that to do? In other words, you submit something, and then a year later, you decide you want to update it with a new document.
Well, in terms of updating, so there's I guess two answers to that question. If there's a document that you need to correct in some way and make minor modifications, that's pretty easy to do. You can submit a newer version to us and we'll simply replace the older one if they're minor changes. If, however, you produce something like a handbook and you publish a new handbook every single year, what we would do is make sure that we always have the most recent version available as our associated file for everyone to download. And then it would really be up to you if you want the previous versions to be viewable so that people can see what the handbook looked like in the past, or those can simply be archived and then not shown to the public. We would have copies, and if you needed a previous version for some reason, we would have that, but we would only have the most recent version available. So that's something that we would discuss on an individual basis.
And again, if anyone has follow-up questions, Kendra is very accessible, and you can email her with follow-up. One more, Kendra, we actually have another question. Are there guidelines as to file size, when to use compressed files, etc.?
Also an excellent question. Yes, there are lots of recommendations. So a little bit later on in the presentation, we're going to be looking at the different types of files that we accept and the file sizes. Our submission form will accept files up to 1 gigabyte. However, we are aware that there are different fields that might have specialized file formats or individual needs. So the guidelines that I'm going to be talking about are really just recommendations. And if you have something that falls outside of those guidelines for some reason, then I would just ask that you contact us directly and we'll take a look at them.
All right, great. Well, let's move ahead here. We have another poll before we get into more of our presentations. And this is just for us to sort of understand and to think a little bit about where you are in your archiving process. So are you at the point of just trying to decide whether you want to archive or not? Maybe you have a project that was prior to the archiving requirement and you're not sure it's something you want to do. Are you in the initial stages of collecting information about archiving, with things like this webinar? Are you in the process of, you want to archive and you're beginning to plan? Are you completely ready? You're ready to go? Or maybe you're writing a grant and working to add archiving info into that proposal. So go ahead and vote again here. And then as in the last poll, if you are someone who highlights other as your reason, we would love to hear about what that was in the chat box. Okay, so lots of folks, not surprisingly, in that initial stage or beginning to plan, initial stage of collecting information or beginning to plan for archiving. A couple people, somebody writing a grant, all right, let's see here, and some others as well. All right. Well, not surprising, Kendra, that we have so many folks who fall into that, collecting information or beginning to plan for archiving.
Yeah, I think that's great. The earlier a project or center thinks about archiving,
the earlier the better,
the easier it's going to be.
All right. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kendra.
Thanks. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, we're really going to focus more on the services that we offer and what kind of assistance we can provide in terms of archiving. So first and foremost, we provide assistance with the archiving planning process, which is what we're going to spend most of today on. We can help you start planning early on in your grant cycle if you're new to the community, or we can help you work with us to streamline the process if you're already a little further along in your grant. We can help you identify which materials are the most appropriate for archiving, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. We can answer questions about the ATE archiving requirement, and if we don't know the answer to your question, of course, Rachel or I can help you find the person who does. We will assist with the ingest of your resources into the ATE Central archive, and we'll talk more about this specifically at the end of the presentation when we go over our online submission form. Like I mentioned earlier, we track the use of your material and provide that information to PIs in the form of activity reports. And finally, we have a new microsite service that might be of interest to you. We will provide to you completely free of charge a customizable URL and access to our user-friendly web interface where you can create and publish your very own website. For the next few slides, we'll be looking at what we call the archiving checklist. This checklist is available on our website at atecentral.net/archiving. And as Mike mentioned earlier on, there is a PDF download available towards the right of your screen above the attendees list. It's called Archiving Checklist Web PDF. The checklist itself is not meant to be a comprehensive step-by-step guide on how to archive. It's merely a set of questions that you might find helpful as you start to think about archiving. And there are more questions on this checklist that we will not be discussing today, so I do encourage you to review the full list if you're interested, and please feel free to ask any questions about any of the bullet points that I don't cover in today's presentation. The checklist was created specifically for the ATE community. It was developed for individuals early on in their planning process. However, many of these questions will still apply to anyone who is further along in the grant cycle or even ready to archive. So, first off, get informed. If you fall under the archiving requirement, I would first recommend that you begin by reading the requirement as it's stated in the RFP. We're going to be covering a lot of that today, but I do still think it's a good idea to go back and look at the actual language. Are you familiar with the ATE Central archiving service? This webinar is clearly a great first step, and we'll be covering a lot today, but you can also find more information on our website, again, at atecentral.net/archiving. Next, ask yourself if you're familiar with the various licensing agreements that are available to you. You're not required to make your materials available under any license, such as Creative Commons licenses. However, NSF does recommend that you consider doing so, and I will come back to this a little later on and talk about which licenses NSF recommends. And finally, after you've completed your information collecting process, do you feel like you're sufficiently informed, or do you still have questions? And if you do, please feel free to reach out to any of us at ATE Central. We're always happy to help. Regardless of where you are in your planning process, I would suggest assigning an archiving specialist. It's just a term that we use on the checklist. Really, the archiving specialist is simply a point person, the person who knows everything about your archiving activities. This person might be a PI of a project or center, a co-PI, or perhaps a staff person. It really doesn't matter, but what is important is that you select someone who is explicitly responsible for archiving and that you make sure everyone knows that that person is responsible. If you do have that archiving specialist or point person, document what that person's responsibilities are. We'll look at examples in just a moment. Once you've identified that person and documented that person's role, communicate that person's role to others inside the project center and to any external project partners who might be helping with the creation of your deliverables. That person is going to be the most effective when others know that he or she is able to help them. Next, plan ahead. And it sounds like many of you are doing that right now. Start with some archiving goals. This is something you might even want to consider doing if you're already a little further along in your grant. I'll provide some examples of what these might look like a little later on as well. But it could be things like ensuring that you meet the NSF archiving requirement, maintaining the integrity of your materials, or properly protecting sensitive information? Have you identified which materials are suitable for archiving and where they will be stored before you provide them to AT Central? And have you created an archiving schedule to use as guide? The schedule outlines what kinds of archivable deliverables you're going to create, who has those materials, when you want to archive it. It's just information to help your archiving specialist know what kind of material they're looking for. And again, we'll look at an example in just a moment. Have you developed a workflow? Have you determined what information you need to maintain the integrity of your archival material? So if you're creating a syllabus, for example, a lot of the information you would need about that syllabus is already on the document. It will likely have the name of the course, the name of the instructor, and the semester in which that course was taught. But if you're creating a series of activities or labs, those materials might not have that information on the document itself. And so how are you going to prevent that important information about who taught the course, when it was taught, what the course name was, from becoming disassociated from those resources, from the activities or labs? Perhaps you're going to use file naming conventions, or maybe you have a spreadsheet with all of the information that's relevant. The way in which you choose to keep track of that information could differ significantly from project to project, so it's really a matter of finding something that works for you. But thinking in advance about what kind of information you might want to keep and how you're going to keep that information can really save you some work down the road. And then finally, there's a follow-up. Have you set an archiving deadline for your project or center? Ideally, that deadline would be before your funding cycle ends to ensure that you have the staffing, the resources, and the time necessary to complete the archiving process. And once you've archived your materials, have you reviewed the metadata records that we've generated to ensure that they're accurate and complete? And please, if there's something that's not entirely the way you would like it done, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. We're always happy to make edits to those metadata records. Okay, so here's an example of the archival planning worksheet. A lot of what we just discussed is provided here in a single document. This document is available on our website as both a Word document and a PDF, so you're more than welcome to download it and edit it in any way that you like. And it also comes with a one-page explanation to help you fill it out. The worksheet is simply a tool to help you think through the archiving process. There is no requirement whatsoever to complete this form. So on this sheet, we first have some information about your project and center and information about your archiving specialist or point person. Then we have some examples of the type of responsibilities that your archiving point person might have. So perhaps you decide that they're responsible for developing, implementing, and maintaining a workflow that supports your archiving efforts. Perhaps this is the person who acquires, organizes, and documents the materials for archiving. They might manage your rights information and affix any licensing terms that you choose to use. This person might serve as a point person and transfer materials to AT Central. And maybe this person also reviews the archival records after AT Central has completed the archiving process. So you can add more responsibilities if you choose, or remove some if you don't feel like they're applicable to your particular project and center. Next, we've also provided some sample goals to help you start thinking about what these might look like. So perhaps your goal is to ensure that your archiving efforts meet the NSF requirement, should you fall under that requirement. A goal could be to maintain the integrity of your archival materials by preserving that contextual information that we just talked about, implementing a workflow that allows for a timely and efficient transfer, and making sure that any personal or sensitive information that you might collect is properly protected. And of course, once again, you can add and remove any of these goals as you see fit. The next section, the table below, is the archiving schedule, which I mentioned briefly earlier on, I believe. The idea here is to give your archiving specialist a frame of reference. What kind of materials should this person be collecting? In the first column, we have some potential resource types. So assessment materials, instructional materials, reference, professional development materials, administrative, and other. This is the way that we here at ATE Central think about materials and try to categorize them, but you might have very different record types, and that's perfectly okay. You're more than welcome, once again, to change these as you see fit. To the right is an example of how you might fill out this table. So perhaps the purpose of your grant is to create instructional materials such as syllabi, lectures, lesson plans, activities, labs, and exams for a particular course. I'm calling my course here Bio 101. By expressing this in writing, your archiving specialist will have a better idea of what kind of material to collect from what we call the custodians. In this case, the custodians might be the course instructors. Those are the people who are the most likely to be creating that material and storing the material before the archiving specialist can collect it. You can also list the names of instructors here, for example, if that'd be more useful to you. Then there's a submission deadline, something to help you keep on track. The last portion of the worksheet is the review process. How frequently will you revisit this worksheet? Much of the information on here will stay the same over time, but what might change is the archiving schedule. You might start creating materials that you originally didn't anticipate, and so you might want to update some of this information periodically. Finally, the last sentence is a completion date, and really try to stick to this completion date. Once again, I would recommend a completion date before the end of your cycle, your grant cycle.
All right. Well, I think you have one more slide. Sorry,
Sure.
Kendra.
So what is it that you can archive? Like I said before, we think of materials as assessment, instructional, reference, and professional development materials. At least this is primarily what we collect. Assessment materials might include things like tests, answer keys, or grading rubrics. Instructional materials covers a very wide variety of content, things like activities, case studies, lesson plans, labs, textbooks, tutorials, and even games or simulations. Reference materials are usually articles and reports, but we also have a lot of career information. And professional development materials most frequently are presentations, workshop materials, and video recordings. We also collect documents that we just call samples. So samples of materials you've created, like manuals or guides, best practices, or survey tools that you think would be valuable to the ATE community as a whole. And finally, we collect some administrative documents. These are materials that are meant to document the success of your project or center, things like internal reports or data sets. And that material doesn't necessarily have to be publicly available. We can archive it for internal purposes, but not distribute that widely. So we do still have the RFP to look at in the submission form, but before we do, are there any questions about the checklist, the worksheet, or the materials that we collect, or anything else that comes to mind?
There does seem to be a good question from Carol, which is, can I archive as I go, or should I wait till the end?
That is a good question, and I think it really depends on what it is that you create as part of your ATE funding. For some projects and centers, archiving at the end makes a lot of sense, especially if the purpose of your grant is to create a report or to organize a conference, something along those lines. But if you're creating a whole lot of material over a long period of time, it might very well make a lot of sense to archive as you go. Either way is perfectly fine with us. There's no requirement either way. But whatever really works for you and helps you stay on track with your archiving efforts, we'd be happy to work with you.
Carol also said that, was asking something like the transcripts of interviews from something that an evaluator is conducting is probably not the kind of thing we'd want to archive, and I would agree that that's correct. Transcripts of interviews unless it was part of maybe a research grant, but it sounds like it's evaluation. So I don't think that would be something we'd generally archive, right, Kendra?
Generally, no. When we talk about sort of survey tools or interviews, we're interested in the cumulative results. So if there's a final report, or if you have data that's not associated with any type of sensitive information that might be of interest to us. But we wouldn't want, let's say if we wanted the survey tool, the list of questions, another project center might really be interested in conducting the same survey. But we wouldn't collect all of the answers to that survey, for example.
Right. Okay, I think that's good. And we have another poll here, our poll question number 3. And we're just interested in what everybody feels like they're going to be archiving. So Kendra talked about assessments, instructional material, reference materials, professional development materials, administrative documents, or other. And again, you're welcome to add that to the chat window if you've chosen other. Mike just opened that poll. Lots of stuff in assessment instructional right away. Some professional development materials. Somebody just put something in other, so that'll be interesting. I'm never surprised to see that most of it is instructional and assessment.
Instructional is a very common type of material that we receive, and professional development material, which we're receiving quite a bit of.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there you go. If anybody wants to pop that other in the chat window and just let us know, we're always interested to see. Okay, thanks, Mike. I think you can close that one. And all right, Kendra, I think you're going to share a little bit about that RFP with us now.
What does the RFP say? So new grantees who apply for and are funded under solicitation, the 2014 through 2016 solicitation, or now the 2017 through 2019 solicitation, are required to archive their deliverables as described in their initial grant proposals with AT Central. So the requirements under both of those solicitations are the same. These deliverables are to be in a digital and archivable format with the intellectual property information clearly displayed. And once again, we have some highlights, so we're going to look at these individually now. Deliverables are the deliverables of any project or center will be described in your original grant proposal, though, like I mentioned earlier, that they may evolve a little bit over time. But generally speaking, deliverables are usually relatively easy to identify, but we can also help with identifying deliverables on a case-by-case basis should you want some more assistance with that. Not all deliverables are digital or even tangible in nature, so perhaps you're funded to organize a student competition or organize a conference. Neither is inherently digital in nature. However, there may very well be some support materials that are available in a digital format, things like handouts, PowerPoint presentations, or even video recordings of your speakers. What we consider an archivable format is outlined in our archiving service policy, once again at atcentral.net/archiving. And I've taken a screenshot here of the general types of formats and file sizes that we accept. So this really addresses the question we had earlier on. And like I said, if you do have file formats or larger file sizes, feel free to contact me so that we can take a look at them. And once again, we do know that some of you use specialized software or produce content in field-specific file formats, and we're happy to review those on a case-by-case basis. But if you're producing audio, video, visual, textual, or courses in a learning management system, here are some file formats that we recommend. And finally, here's that intellectual property piece. Under the RFP, grantees are encouraged to make their materials available under a Creative Commons license. Specifically, NSF encourages the use of the attribution share alike, and the attribution non-commercial share alike license. All of these licenses allow users to copy, distribute, transmit, and generally adapt copyrighted work to varying degrees as long as they attribute and share the work in the manner specified under each of these licenses. And if you do choose to use the CC license, please affix that license to the work itself. So that brings us to submitting for archiving, which is our last topic for today. Here's a screenshot of our online submission form. The link I've provided throughout the presentation is finally listed for you here, atcentral.net/archiving. And you do need to be logged in to AT Central to submit via this form. There's also a second link on this slide, the /archiving guide. You'll find examples of the submission form and how to submit different types of materials on that page. We accept basically 3 different types of materials through this form. You can submit individual resources for archiving, so an individual PowerPoint presentation or PDF, for example. Secondly, we accept collections of related materials. So let's say you have a lesson plan, an activity, and a test that you've used together in a single unit. Feel free to drop all of those into a single zip file and then upload that zip file to the form. So you will only be able to upload one file to this form, either an individual file or a zip file. And finally, we do accept entire academic courses. As you might have noticed on one of the previous slides, the file format that we accept for academic courses is the IMSCC file. It's one possible file format that you might receive if you export your entire course out of your learning management system. And we accept that exported course in the IMSCC format so that others can import that file into their own learning management systems and access that course in its entirety. Like I said before, if you take a look at that URL towards the bottom of the slide, atcentral.net/archiving guide, you will find examples there, including a good example of how to submit an entire academic course. When you submit through the form, there are some required fields. They're listed on the left here, and you can identify them when you are logged in because they are circled. Put a little arrow right there. There's a yellow circle around them. And those fields include the associated file fields. So in order to submit through the form, you do have to upload one document. As I mentioned earlier, that document can only be 1 gigabyte in size, but that's rather large, so we haven't had any issues with that yet. Your award number is required, and then also contact name and email. Since you're logged into AT Central, when you submit this will auto-populate, but you're more than welcome to change that information if you would like to. And finally, you are asked to accept the terms of submission. When you submit to the archive, you are stating that you are either the copyright owner or an authorized representative of the copyright owner, and that you've obtained any third-party permissions if that pertains to the material that you're submitting. And you grant Internet Scout Research Group, which is where AT Central lives, permission to use, copy, migrate, and modify these materials for preservation or archiving purposes. And finally, that you authorize the unrestricted distribution of your work via the AT Central resource portal or other media, and that's referring to things like our blog or the ACC newsletter. If you're submitting materials that you don't want made publicly available, I'd recommend contacting me directly rather than using the submission form because you will need to agree to the terms in order to submit through the form. And if you're submitting multiple documents that are unrelated, please submit multiple forms rather than placing unrelated materials into a single zip file. If you're at the end of your funding cycle, though, and you have a lot of material to submit, please don't feel obligated to use this form. It's really just for your convenience. So you're also more than welcome to contact me if you have a large collection of materials that you want to submit, and we can explore some other submission options. Perhaps Dropbox or a Google folder might make more sense depending on the the quantity of materials that you have. So, and with that, I will pass the presentation back to Rachel.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a few questions here. Somebody, Alok, said that they tried to submit but got an error message and that they are not authorized to access this area. It may be that they weren't logged in. Do you think that's the problem, Kendra?
That could very well be the case.
So you need to be logged in to the AT Central system in order to submit, and so you can contact Kendra afterwards and we can figure out why you weren't able to do that. Somebody else talked about the fact that they are trying to actually archive some components of a website. Have we come up against that? They want to archive some parts of a website. So it may be that we want to figure out either whether the content should be made into something non-web-based, or I don't know that we've dealt with that before, have we, Kendra?
So far we have not archived any type of, we have not archived websites, let's put it that way. But I'd be happy to take a look at what these materials are and see what it is that we can do to archive it.
Okay. All right, so we've had a couple of other questions, but we are starting to get a little bit, we've got maybe 5 or 6 more minutes. One person did ask a little bit about if we could talk just a little bit more about the licensing. They were a little confused about the licensing. Do you want to just share a little bit more information about how people, I know we have follow-up a URL and we can email them more information about licensing. Is there anything else? I'm not exactly sure what they were, what specifically they were confused about, but I know a lot of people don't know much about Creative Commons and licensing.
Yeah, at the end of the presentation on one of our final slides, I'll provide some additional links, and one of those links is going to be to the creativecommons.org website, and I believe it's creativecommons.org/licenses. They have very short descriptions of what each of the licenses are, so you can just look at the attribution share alike, and attribution non-commercial share alike for very brief descriptions of how those licenses differ from one another. And then they also have a nice page where they explain how to attach their licenses to different types of media. So how to add a license to a PDF document, how to add a license to a video, and they go through that on a step-by-step basis. I will also note here that we will be at this year's PI conference as usual, and we'll have a Birds of a Feather session on archiving. In that session, we're going to focus on the worksheet and really help you think through the process on an individual basis, and you can work through the worksheet as we go, and that'll be an opportunity to talk a little bit more about licensing as well.
We got one other question. Somebody just chatted with me just now and said, how long does archiving take? Which of course depends a lot on what we're archiving, because some people literally send us hundreds of things and some people only send us a few. So it's sort of a tough question to answer in a way, don't you think?
It is. It is. Some things can go very quickly, but generally what happens is after we've received a submission form or you've contacted us, we look at the material, ask any questions that we might have about it, and we put you in a queue to get archived. Once that material is complete, we send you an email with a link to the metadata records that we've created. And so it really does depend on how much you're submitting and how many materials we already have in the queue.
All right, so we have one more poll here, and we just want to know, now that we've kind of talked through, we're very close to the end of our webinar today, what you feel like you're still struggling with or need help with. This is helpful to us, particularly as Kendra said, we're going to be at the PI meeting, so just kind of knowing what people feel most concerned about. Is it knowing what materials they should archive, preparing those materials, the licensing or intellectual property issues? Somebody raised that in chat. Maybe everything or something else that we don't have on this list. So Mike, can you open that? Somebody just asked us how much storage space we currently have. You know, John, I have no idea. I don't know if Kendra does either. Ed probably is the person who would know that, although maybe you know Kendra.
I would not know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Sorry, we're not giving you any wow factor on that one, John. Sorry. All right, so it looks like at this point we're kind of evenly divided on our poll between just identifying the materials as well as the licensing and IP issues.
Yeah, and actually, if you're available for our birds of a feather, those are two things that we can work through with you on an individual basis.
All right. And nobody put anything in others, so okay, so let's close that, and then we have one last slide, and we're going to ask you to fill out a survey for us in just a moment. But Kendra, can you pull up that last slide?
Oops. Okay. There we go. So here's some of the links that I mentioned. The atcentral.net/archiving is where you'll find all the information that we covered today. On that site is a link to /archiving guide. Once again, you'll find a lot of examples there. I've also provided two additional links. One is /AR guide. That's activity report guide. I mentioned those earlier on. If you're a PI and have not yet received a report, or you're just curious what those might look like, that's a good resource to look at and learn about what information it is that we provide. And then we also have a page on some of the sustainability that we provide. Rachael does a lot of good work in that area, so I would encourage you to take a look. Finally, two more links, one to copyright.gov. If you have copyright questions, it's a good place to start, and that Creative Commons license that, or Creative Commons website about licenses that I just mentioned a few moments ago. On this last slide here, oh, sorry, Rachael, I just wanted to give you the information for our Birds of a Feather at the PI meeting. So please feel free to join us. If you've already started working on your worksheet, we are happy to sit down with you and take a look at that. And if you just want to get started during that session, that's also something that you can do. It's going to be a very hands-on sort of working session. And we will also have our booth in the showcases session every day, Monday through Wednesday of the conference. So please feel free to stop by anytime and ask any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendra. And folks, remember, you don't have to try to jot down the URLs or any of this information because the webinar is recorded. And you'll, as Mike mentioned, you'll be getting these slides. And we'd really like you to stay on and take our survey. I think Mike will be opening that survey right now. That should open for you in a new window. And it really helps us to learn more about how useful the work that we're doing is. It's nice for us to be able to report back to NSF that folks find these sorts of webinars helpful. It helps us learn a little bit about how we can do better maybe, or what you guys are interested in learning about. So thank you so much, everybody. Please fill the survey out. And at this point, we're concluding our formal webinar. Thanks to Kendra and thanks to Mike and his crew for doing a super job as always.
Thanks, everyone.
Hope to see you guys.
The audience would like to thank you. We're just amazed that you picked up your laptop, ran out of the building, and kept the webinar going. That was pretty cool.
Oh, thank you. We'll see how it all sounds when it's recorded. We can all get some good laughs in on that one. It was an interesting start to the webinar.
Well, thank you again, Rachael. That concludes us for today, everyone. We'll leave the seminar, the survey up for a few more minutes. Rachael and Kendra, thanks. That concludes our webinar.